Hi everybody, I'm Blendini and we're going to create a cactus in Blender 2.82. Be sure to enable the Node Wrangler add-on. This will make it easier to create procedural textures with nodes. Go to Preferences, Add-ons, search for Node, and make sure this box next to Node Wrangler is checked. Okay, let's begin. I always put the default lamp and camera in their own collection. I'm actually going to keep the default cube and use it to create the cactus's planter. I guess I should label it, let's see, planter. Okay, select the cube and scale it down, holding S on your keyboard, left click and drag. Control A on your keyboard, select rotation and scale, apply that transformation. Tab into edit mode and select the bottom face of the cube and scale that down and move it up a bit. Control R to add an edge loop. Scroll the mouse wheel to increase the number of edge loops to about 6. Select this loop, enable proportional editing, and scale up until the desired shape is achieved. Numbers 1, 2, and 3 on your keyboard will switch the selection mode to vertex, edge, and face respectively. Hit 3 to enable face selection mode. Select the top face, hit I to inset and scale inward. Hit E and drag downward to extrude this face into the planter. With the face still selected, hit P on your keyboard to open this menu. Choose Selection to separate your selection into its own object. 7 on the number pad takes us into top view. We'll add the subsurface modifier to smooth the mesh later, but first, use Control R to add an edge loop and slide the edge loop towards the corner. Repeat this 4 times for each corner. This process will keep the corners nice and tight once the subsurface modifier is added. Go to the Modifier tab, add a subsurface modifier, turn on smooth shading, and set the number of viewport subdivisions to 2. That's it for the planter. Let's move on to the sand. First, we'll set the origin to the center of the object's geometry. To do this, select the object, go to the Object menu, Set Origin, and then click Geometry to Origin. Tab into Edit mode. Subdivide the plane 5 times. Then, grabbing the center vertex, ensure proportional editing is on, raise the vertex along the Z-axis to create a little mound. Scale it out a bit, and that's it. The rest is done in Materials. Control A to apply the transformation. Now onto the cactus. Right-click the sand mound and set the cursor to the selected object's origin. Shift A to add a circle. Change the vertice count to 18 and the radius to 0.4. Use Tab to switch into edit mode. Select all the vertices and hit E to extrude upwards. Hitting Z on your keyboard will snap the extrusion to the Z-axis. With the top vertices selected, hit F to fill the selected vertices with a face. I on your keyboard to inset those vertices, S to scale inward, and Alt-M to bring up the Merge menu. From the menu, select at center and the vertices will be merged at the center. Toggle on X-ray view mode to see through our model. The 1, 2, and 3 number keys at the top of your keyboard toggle between selecting vertices, edges, or faces, respectively. Selecting 2 will activate Edge Selection mode, meaning we can select only edges. Hit C to bring up the Circle Select tool, and holding the left mouse button, swipe across the column's midsection, selecting all of these edges. Go to the Select menu and find Checker Deselect. This will deselect every other selected edge. Scale the selected edges inward. Clicking Shift Z while scaling will omit movement along that axis. Add edge loops just as we did with the planter using Control R and use the scroll wheel on your mouse to increase the number of edges added. Select the top ring and with proportional editing on, scale the top inward by pressing S and dragging with the mouse. Repeat the process at the base. Go to the Modifier tab and add a subsurface modifier. To refine the shape, we will bevel the edges by adding the bevel modifier. Let's move this modifier above the subsurface modifier. Tab into Edit mode. We only want to bevel our outer edges, so we'll select them all and create a vertex group for them. To do that, we go to the Object Data Properties, click the plus sign to create a new vertex group, rename it and call it Spines Full, and be sure to click Assign. Back to the Modifier tab, and in the Bevel modifier, under Limit Method, select Vertex Group and choose Spines Full. This will limit the bevel effect to the edges in this group. To specify the amount of bevel, select % and pick any value you like. This gives us some control. But if we increase the number of segments, we can refine the bevel. Right-click to set the shading to smooth. To further refine this shape, we'll add a bevel modifier to the inner edges. Tab into Edit mode, select the inner edges by holding Alt and clicking any edge. After the first edge is selected, hold the Shift key and select the remaining edges. Create a new vertex group. We'll call this one Edges Inner. Don't forget to click Assign. Back to the Modifier tab and add another bevel modifier. Set the limit method to Vertex Group and select the Edges Inner group we just created. Just as before, increase the segments and use % to set the amount of bevel as you see fit. We're going to use a particle system to generate the spines for our cactus, so first we'll make the particle, which will be a basic bundle of spines. Shift A on your keyboard to add a cube and scale it down. Control A to apply the transformation. Tab into Edit and add an edge loop using Control R. Slide that edge loop up a little bit. Select the bottom and top faces of the cube and scale those down. Select the top face, Shift D on your keyboard to duplicate it, and then hit P on your keyboard to bring up the Separate menu and choose Selection to turn this selection into its own object. Select the new object. In Object Mode, go to the Object menu, Set Origin, and select Origin to Geometry. I'm going to slide this down a bit. Tab into Edit mode. With the face selected, extrude the face along the Z-axis. Scale one end down to a near point. Let's adjust this base. Scale that down too a bit. Now we'll add a subdivision modifier. I'm making a few minor adjustments here. Next, we'll add an edge loop to the spine and slide it towards the base. Add a subsurface modifier to the spine as well, and then we'll adjust its position. Now, let's create a material for the spines. As personal preference, I set up my own materials workspace. Click the plus symbol up here, General, and select Modeling. Double-click any tab name to rename it, and then right-click any pane's edge to bring up the split menu. I put a vertical split here and turn this second pane into the shader editor. Select the spine, go to the Materials tab and create a new material. Go to the shader editor and hit Shift A to bring up the Add menu. Select Texture and find the gradient texture to add a gradient texture node to our material. With the gradient texture node selected, hit Shift T and Blender will generate a texture coordinate and mapping node connected to the texture. Shift A to open the Add menu again, go to Converter and select Color Ramp. Connect the gradient texture's color output to the color ramp's FAC input. Hold Shift and Control down simultaneously while clicking any node in your material to see the effects of that node and everything leading up to it on your object. Here we can see our gradient just barely. Almost looks like the object's shadow, but if we increase the amount of black using this color ramp, we can see the gradient clearly. Rotate the gradient along the Y-axis 90 degrees. We'll add a few more color markers here to create a gradient that starts out black, fades into a light yellow, and then fades into a dark brown. Connect the color ramp's color output to the principal shader's base color input. Lower the specular and roughness. Right-click on the spine and turn on smooth shading. With that complete, we'll fill out the remaining spines for this bundle. Using Shift-D, duplicate the spine object. Select the object, hit G to grab it, and X to snap the transformation to the X-axis. Rotate the object along the Y-axis. Now we could position all of these spines manually, but arrays work well for this. In order for this to work, the origin point of our array object and the empty object must be in the exact same place. The empty will be in the same spot as our first spine, so we can align our origins of the first spine and the second spine together. To do this, go to the object mode. Move the spine along the x-axis until the origin is aligned with the origin of the first spine, marked here with the 3D cursor. Tab into Edit mode and move the mesh back into position. Notice the origin stays put. Let's go back into the modeling workspace. Shift-A to bring up the Add menu. Go to Empty and select Single Arrow. Any empty will do. This is just a personal preference. In fact, you could even use the original spine for this. Let's scale this down a bit. Be sure to apply rotation and scale transformations before using an array. Now let's go to the Modifier tab and add an array modifier. Uncheck Relative Offset, check Object Offset. Use this eyedropper here to select the empty we just created. Now we'll increase the count on our array to 6. Select the empty and rotate it about 60 degrees around the Z-axis. Let's add another group of spines to this by adding another array modifier. Select the array of spines and add a new array modifier. Let's minimize the first array modifier by clicking this triangle. On our new second array modifier, uncheck Relative Offset. Using Shift-A, add another single arrow empty. Scale it up so we can tell the difference between the first one we used. In our array modifier, check Object Offset and use the eyedropper to select the new empty we just created. Now we can adjust a new group of spines by adjusting this empty. Grab the empty and move it along the Z-axis. Scale the empty down to make the spine smaller. Rotate the empty to rotate the small group of spines. With the spines selected, let's tab into Edit mode and rotate them a bit more. To use the object as a particle, we need to apply the arrays and group the parts together. Select the spines, go to the Modifier tab, and click Apply on each array modifier. Now select the empties and hit X to delete them. Let's scale this center piece up a bit. Holding the Shift key, drag the mouse across the objects to select them. Use Ctrl-J to join the selected items as one object. In the shader editor, we can see the material we made earlier has been applied to this new object. Let's adjust this gradient by shifting around these color markers. Hit Ctrl-A to apply the scale and rotation. And let's name this Spine Bundle. We might as well name some of this other stuff too. Let's see, Cactus, Sand, Planter. Alright, time to get into particles. Our particle system will add a spine bundle on each vertex. We only want the outer vertices, which is the selection used in the spine's full group. These lower vertices will be buried in the sand, so we'll remove them from the vertex group. Select the cactus, tab into edit mode. Ensure that the spine's full group selection is showing. Enable X-ray view and hit C to activate the circle selection tool. Hold down the Shift key and swipe across the bottom row, deselecting them. Create a new vertex group, label it Spines Density, and click Assign. Let's go to the Particle tab. Click the plus sign to add a particle system. Switch to Hair instead of Emitter. Yikes! If your system doesn't look right out of the gate, the first thing to check would be your object's normals. It doesn't hurt to recalculate the outside normals by going to Mesh, Normals, Recalculate Outside. That's much better. Okay, back to the Particle tab. The first thing we're going to do is lower the number of particles under Emission. This just makes it easier to work with. Under the Render tab, we want to render these particles as an object. Instance Object allows us to define the object to use. Click the eyedropper and select the spine bundle. Under Object, check Object Rotation. Our spine bundles are a bit small here, so let's scale this up using the object scale in the particle system. Scroll down the particle system settings and look for vertex groups and expand it. Click on Density, select our spine's density group. Why aren't the spines lining up on the edges? Well, let's take a look at Source. The default option is to emit particles from the mesh's faces. So the faces connected to our edges are game for particle placement. We don't want that. We want our spines to match our vertex placement, so we switch face to verts. The orientation of our particles is off, and to fix this, we need to rotate the particle source, our spine bundle up here. Select the spine bundle, hit R on your keyboard for rotate, Y to rotate around the Y axis, and 90 to rotate the selection 90 degrees. Now they're all facing outward. We can increase the number of spines until every vertex is covered. We could stop there, but some cactuses have a bit of a twist to them. It's super easy to do in Blender, so let's do that now. Select the cactus and return to the Modifier tab. Add a simple deform modifier. We're going to use the twist function, which is selected by default. The modifier will twist the mesh around a selected axis, the number of degrees selected. We want the twist to be along the z-axis. Set the angle to whatever you like. Now let's take a look. There appear to be some gaps here, so let's add more particles by increasing the number in the emission section of the particle system. Alright, I'm going to reduce the degree of twist on this. That looks better. And that's it for modeling. Let's move on to materials, starting with the planter. This is pretty straightforward. Into the shader editor. This was the default cube, so it has a default material. Let's change some of these settings to whatever you like. Select the sand mound. Delete the existing material and add a new one. Label it sand. Shift-A brings up the Add menu, go to Texture, and select Voronoi. With this Voronoi texture selected, hit Ctrl-T. This will add a texture coordinate and mapping node in front of the texture node. Shift-A down to Converter and select Color Ramp. Connect the Voronoi distance to the color ramp's FAC. Connect the color to the shader's color, and we get this. Click and drag across a set of numbers to change the values simultaneously. We're going for small here. Let's try 20. Adjust the color ramp and apply smooth shading. And let's change these colors to sandy colors. Let's increase this size to 40 and lower the specular roughness and sheen. Now we're going to add a bump texture. Shift-A, Texture, Noise Texture. Control-T for the mapping and texture coordinate node. And add another color ramp. Shift-A, Converter, Color Ramp. We're going to use this texture to create a normal map. So hit Shift-A and select Vector, Bump. Connect these normals and connect the color ramp's color to the bump node's height input. Lower the bump node's strength to 0.2. Connect the noise texture's output to the color ramp's FAC. Increase the mapping node's scale to 25 and increase the contrast by bringing these color markers closer together on the color ramp. Holding Control and Shift together, click on the principled shader to see the entire material. Now we're going to change the geometry in the material by adding displacement. Click, hold, and drag your mouse over the nodes we used for the material's normal map and select them. Shift-D to duplicate these nodes and move them closer to the material output node. Reduce the scale in your mapping node to 1. Shift-A, Vector, and select Displacement node. Hold Shift and Control and click on this color ramp just to see its effect on the model in the viewport. The Displacement node will adjust the geometry's height with black areas being lower or 0 and white areas being higher or 1. Let's increase the noise texture scale to around 8.7 and adjust this color ramp a bit. Connect the color ramp's color to the Displacement node's height. Let's change the scale to 0.02. Hold Shift and Control and click on the color ramp. Now let's connect the displacement from the Displacement node to the displacement input on the material output node. Now, holding Control and Shift key again, click on the principled shader to see the entire material in the viewport. This is what it looks like in Eevee. I'm going to adjust this color ramp a little bit. Now let's take a look at it in render mode. Unhide the light and camera by checking this collection. Nice. My final render will be in cycles though, so let's switch over to cycles. As you can see, our displacement is not showing any actual displacement of the mesh. That's because there are 3 main things required to get node displacement working in cycles. The first thing is on the Render tab. Let's change Feature Set to Experimental. The second thing is to add a subsurface modifier to the mesh in question and check Adaptive. The third thing is go to the material with the displacement on it and scroll towards the bottom until you find Settings. Open that and you'll see a displacement option with the default setting of bump. We want to select displacement and bump since we have both in our material. And that's all it takes. And now our displacement noise texture is displacing our mesh's geometry. I'm going to lower the scale to 0.013. And let's go back to viewport shading mode. Unhide the cactus with Alt-H. I'm going to scale this down a tad. And let's lower it into the sand and give it a little tilt with Rotate. And it looks like some of these lower spines are still jutting into the sand. This can be easily fixed. We just need to remove the lowest vertices from our density vertex group. Let's go into edit mode, go to the vertex groups, and select Spines Density. Click the Select button to have the vertex group selected on your model. We want to remove these bottom vertices, so we need to use this Remove button. The Remove button will remove any selected vertices from the selection. So we want to be sure the only vertices selected when we click Remove are the ones we want removed from the vertex group. Enable X-ray view and select this last row of vertices using the Circle Select tool. Now, click Remove. Click Select again to select the vertex group's vertices on our mesh. We can see the bottom vertices are no longer included in the vertex group. If we go back to Object Mode, we can see the spine bundle particle system has accounted for the changes in the vertex group. Now for the cactus material. We'll use the same basic steps used for the sand: a texture driving color, a texture driving the bump map, and a texture driving displacement. In Object Mode, select the cactus, and on the Materials tab, add a new material, and let's call this Cactus. Let's zoom out and find these nodes. Add a noise texture by hitting Shift-A on your keyboard, selecting Texture, and then Noise Texture. Control-T on your keyboard to add the mapping and texture coordinate nodes. Shift-A, Converter, Color Ramp to add a color ramp. And now let's hold Shift and Control together and click on the color ramp to view it on the model. Adjust the color ramp as you see fit and scale down the noise a bit. Let's change these colors. We'll refine them later, but this will do for a basic start. For the bump map, Shift-A to add another noise texture. Control-T for the mapping and texture coordinate nodes. Add another color ramp. Holding Shift and Control, click on the color ramp to view it on the model. Let's add a bump node, Control-A, Vector, and then Bump, and connect its normal output to the shader normal's input. On the mapping node, change the scale to 25. And bring these color markers on the color ramp in a bit. Connect the color ramp's color output to the bump node's height. Change the strength on the bump node to about 0.2. Let's connect our color back to the shader. I'm going to lower the specular. For the roughness, we'll use a color ramp in one of our existing textures. So let's select this color ramp, Control-D to duplicate it, and move it over here. Let's move these nodes out of the way a bit. Now connect this noise texture's color to this color ramp's fact, and connect the ramp's output to the shader's roughness. Now let's adjust these color markers a bit. Hold Shift and Control and select the principled shader to see the total result. Let's lower the strength on this bump and increase the distortion on this noise texture. Increase the sheen, and now we're going to add a bit of subsurface. Subsurface scatters the light below the surface using a color of your choice. We don't need much, somewhere between 0.8 to 0.15 works well for this. Let's go back to the particle system and lower the scale a bit of our particles. Now increase the scale randomness. This will vary the size of each particle randomly. Now I'm going to modify the shape using proportional editing. Tab into Edit Mode. Alt-click on an edge to select the entire edge loop and press O on your keyboard to enable proportional editing. Modify the shape as you see fit. I'm just going to scale this out a bit at the top, and then selecting an edge near the bottom, I'm going to scale that out as well. Some of our spines are overlapping, so we'll lower the emission number to fix that. Uncheck Random Order. Now let's tab into Edit Mode and hit Ctrl-R to add extra edge loops. These new vertices will each have a spine bundle on them. Now let's tab back into Object Mode. That looks better, but some of these spine bundles are still off. To find the culprit, we've got to go back to the modifier stack. Expand the first bevel modifier. When using the bevel modifier, if the number of segments is greater than 2, the geometry changes can affect particle placement. I'm not sure why this happens, I'm guessing math reasons, but this can be fixed by lowering the segment count to 2. And that's it. With the modeling and basic materials complete, let's add a plane for our cactus to rest on. Select the planter, right-click, and select Cursor to Selected to align our 3D cursor with the origin point of the planter. Shift-A and go to Mesh and add a plane. Scale it along the X-axis. 1 on the number keypad takes us into front view. Lower this plane until it's just beneath the planter. 0 on the number keypad snaps the view to the camera's view. Let's see what we have. We could move the camera around manually, but I prefer to move the scene around, setting the viewport to the view I'd like my image to have. Then I snap the camera to the viewport. Hit Ctrl, Alt, and the keypad 0 at the same time to snap our camera to the viewport. Now select the camera, hit G to grab it, and hold the middle mouse wheel button down and scroll to zoom in or out. Hit G to grab the camera again, and Z to move the camera along the Z-axis. So very quickly I'm going to add some stripes. In edit mode, add 2 more edge loops to create small stripes near the planter's top, like this. Hit the number key 3 on the keyboard to activate face selection mode. Hold Alt and left click along any edge inside the row of faces you'd wish to select. Hold Shift after the first selection and continue clicking to add to your selection. In the Materials tab, use the plus sign to add a new material. From the drop-down list, select the same material we've been using for the planter. Click the new material icon here. This will make a new material copy. This way we retain all the material settings from the principled shader of the original material and can just change the color. And changing the stripes to a light yellow. In order to see the change, we must assign the new material to our selection by clicking Assign. Now let's add a simple material for this plane. We'll call it Base and increase the metallic and lower the specular just a bit. The background used in this image is an HDRI, which provides both the background image and the lighting for our model. Let's add one now. Open World Properties. In the Surface section, Surface should be set to background. The color is currently set to this gray. We want to use an HDRI environment texture, so click on this small circle to access the menu and select Environment Texture. The texture I'm using is from HDRIHaven.com. HDRI Haven has tons of HDRIs across a variety of categories that are 100% free. I'm using an outdoor HDRI called Small Harbor 02. I use the 2K resolution for this tutorial. Let's go to Render View. Now I'm going to rotate the scene by left-clicking anywhere on the stage and dragging until I like what I see. Let's add some displacement to our cactus. Select the cactus and go into the shader editor. Shift-D to duplicate these nodes used for the normal map and drag them to the other side of the shader. Hold Shift and Control to see the effect of the color ramp in the viewport. Change the mapping scale to 5 and decrease the texture's distortion to 0.3. Actually, let's change the mapping scale to 3. Let's adjust these color markers a bit. Delete this bump node and use Shift-A, go to Vector and select Displacement to add a displacement node. Connect the color ramp to the height input and use a small scale like 0.01. Holding Shift and Control, select the principled shader to see the entire material on the model. A few adjustments here and there. Now to see the displacement effects in cycles, you may remember we have 3 steps, but 2 of them, adding a subsurface modifier to the model and selecting experimental in the render tab, have already been done. The last thing to do is in the material itself. So let's select the Material tab, scroll down to Settings, and select Displacement and Bump under Surface. Last, some minor tweaks and adjustment to materials. And that's how I make a cactus in Blender 2.82 using procedural textures.